Yegenah Torbati, welcome.
Thank you so much.
I feel really lucky to have a chance to talk to you for so many reasons, but in part because right now, what you are an expert in and what you are covering seems to be at the center of the world. And I'm wondering if you can just explain the last most recent story that you filed for the Washington Post.
Sure. So right now I'm in Istanbul, Turkey, which is where I've lived for the past 4 months or so. I moved here to cover Iran and Turkey for the Washington Post. And that assignment came to a premature end with the recent layoffs that affected you, me, and hundreds of our colleagues, unfortunately. And the last story that I did, which I did not realize would be my last story for the Post, was a team collaboration with several colleagues on visual forensics and kind of more traditional reporting that basically dug into one uh, act of state violence on one night in one city in Iran during last month's protests. And we chose that method because, there had been a lot of sort of numbers floating around how many people had been killed and what exactly had happened. There had been a huge internet shutdown for weeks that made it very difficult to actually know what was happening inside the country. And so we thought, why don't we just pour all of our firepower, at least for that moment, into just trying to figure out with as much detail as we could what happened in one place on one night. And we were able to do that. We got multiple eyewitness accounts. We analyzed videos and were able to kind of put together this narrative and almost like a timeline of what occurred in the city of Rasht on one of the evenings, one of the most violent evenings of the protests in January. And what we found was that Iranian protesters, had been kind of demonstrating for days, but really things had really peaked. And they, on a night when security forces opened fire at them, many of them had taken shelter in the Rasht Bazaar. Now, the bazaar catches fire. We don't exactly know how or why, but when people tried to flee the fire,
استانداری رشت نزدیک 8 یا 10 تا کشته و زخمی دادیم تا
they were gunned down by security forces. And we have this from multiple eyewitnesses. And, we just felt it was really important to, in a country where things are very opaque often, and it's just difficult to kind of get a sense of what's happening, we felt it was important to document as much as we could.
I don't want to gloss over it.
Mhm.
As people are fleeing from a fire, running towards people in uniform, it is
Mhm.
those people in uniform who open fire.
That is what witnesses told us, multiple witnesses. And I think that really underscores the violence of the protests the violence of the state response, I should say, against the protests that we saw last month. And that is how I think, we hear these numbers that seem just very difficult to believe in some cases or in some ways, and kind of incomprehensible and definitely unprecedented. But that is an example, I think, of how such a large number of people, civilians, could be killed. It's that kind of indiscriminate violence that leads to those kinds of numbers.
And to put a finer point on it, the headline of the story is Iranian forces massacred protesters fleeing burning market, witnesses say, which almost directly answers the question I probably should have started this whole interview with is what is at stake for what is happening currently in Iran? So much of coverage in places that are not the US, when it's reported on in the US, there's the underlying question of how does it relate to me? Why should I
Mhm.
care?
I mean, I think Iran is full of really interesting human stories that any person can relate to. We see really continuing examples of bravery amongst the Iranian people. And so I think so, that's on one level. On another level, Iran is a country and a government where it started out with a certain base of support, 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And over time, that support has really narrowed. And that raises all sorts of questions about, for maybe our country, for other countries, um, how do we kind of grapple with or treat people who, or think about people who maybe supported one system and then um, turned against it or fought against it later on, or were cast out. I think those are really interesting human and political questions that would be good for people to grapple with kind of all over the world. And then also just on a kind of geopolitical, like sort of bald, like political interests level. What happens in Iran is very important for US foreign policy and has been a major preoccupation of US foreign policy for 5 decades, even before the revolution in 1979, but certainly after it. And so, whether Iran is stable, peaceful, democratic, or not, that has an enormous impact on the region around it and on the rest of the world, in my view, as someone who's covering the country right now.
And just to read a couple of headlines from the day that we're recording, Friday, February
Mhm.
20th. New York Times, president acknowledges that he is weighing limited strike on Iran. Washington Post, Trump appears ready to attack Iran as U.S. strike forces take shape. And from the Wall Street Journal, U.S. military hardware pouring into the Middle East. And in the run up to that, you get notified from the Washington Post that your work is discontinuing, which seems to be the story of US media and its changing landscape and geopolitics. Did you expect to find yourself in the middle of so many pressing storylines?
Um, I think, as someone who really wanted to cover Iran for a long time and did so in the past, and then kind of took some time to cover other things, and then kind of came back to it, I always knew that like when Iran is in the news, it's really in the news. And then, there'll be sometimes years that go by where it's not really a major story. And as a beat reporter, you could kind of just cover it as almost a normal beat. But there are these moments like the 12-day war, when Israel attacked Iran and the US ended up joining in back in June 2025, during the Woman Life Freedom protests in 2022. I wasn't really a reporter back then, but the 2009 Green Movement protests, I imagine, where it just dominates the news in the West, and it can really do that. And I think, in America, we have sort of this lingering trauma and memory of the hostage crisis, and so many Americans sort of have some kind of relation to Iran or some memory of it. Um, in terms of the layoff, I was not expecting that. And, it's been a bit of a disorienting and bewildering moment just because at the very moment where there's so much news and where I would probably be writing, every day or very, very frequently at least, I'm kind of not. And it's been a bit difficult, and I have story ideas. I don't know what to do with them. And I hope to very much continue in this line of work and on this topic. And we'll kind of see what happens with that. But yeah, it has been a bit, for these two things to be happening kind of at the same time has been a bit bewildering.
And you've handled it remarkably well. Even agreeing to appear here is a sign of your dedication to the work of covering some of the most important stories. To help people understand a little bit about how you do your work, can
Mhm.
you just explain, particularly on the last story, how were you able to find information and verify it to the point that it could stand up to scrutiny and be worth publishing?
So, I can't speak to the work of our incredible visual forensics team, which includes the lead reporter on that story, Nidu Tabrizi, Meg Kelly, others as well. And they kind of had the responsibility of sort of verifying the visuals, and they have techniques and things for doing that are very rigorous. Um, it's kind of like almost any other story. You want multiple sources, and you sort of can test sources' credibility in different ways, asking them maybe how they know something or what, asking for more details on what they saw. It's kind of an imperfect art, but that's why we wanted to have multiple eyewitnesses whose accounts could corroborate each other's, and we have to kind of acknowledge the limitations. It's very, very difficult to work as a reporter in Iran, particularly for a Western outlet. And so, that has some costs in terms of access and being able to maybe go to the market itself and see what happened and talk to more eyewitnesses. But at the same time, given the nature of Iran's government, being outside also gives us the ability to report on, to do investigative stories or to do kinds of things that would be very, very difficult to do from inside the country. So you're sort of always weighing these things. We also talk to human rights groups, and they have networks of people that they speak to that can kind of get them more information. We kind of have a variety of sources that we can draw on to, and of course, this is also where expertise comes in handy. So, I covered Iran over a decade ago for Reuters. I've just finished writing a book about the country that involved talking to, over 130 sources, spending years just kind of steeped in this material, getting to know the issues. And that gives you a certain level of expertise that you kind of use to sort of judge the credibility of sources going forward. So that, Iran is a difficult country to cover. I think it often requires language fluency, and also just like a familiarity with this very complex system and kind of complicated and nuanced society as well. But there are ways to get information out still.
And it's incredible how you find sources, connect with them, communicate with them securely, and language and cultural fluency, which you have as someone who speaks Farsi, Persian. I go back and forth as to which way to describe it.
I was told by my college professor, Abbas Amanat, that it should be Persian. When
Well,
when you're speaking in English, it's Persian. Saying Farsi is like using the word for Persian in Persian. It's like saying Espanol or Alemán. But that he wrote that on one of my papers, and I never forgot.
professors are never wrong. Note taken. Um, I don't imagine it's easy covering not only issues of life and death on this magnitude, but also how do you manage
Hmm.
covering stories that are not just difficult, but that have a direct connection to who you are and your family as well.
I mean, for sure, like my family comes from Iran. I grew up with, Iranian culture and traditions, and I have a connection to the country and, visited when I was younger. Um, but I don't know that it's
When did you
all
visit?
that
If you don't mind me asking, like what years?
sure. This would be kind of, early 90s to like, 2009, 10 would be the last time.
So
Um,
current regime,
oh yeah,
just
yeah, I'm not that old, Ozzy.
just making sure. So you remember
Um,
what it was like when the country was operating under this regime as the regime wants it to be seen as.
I mean, yeah, it was sort of the mid to late 90s into the early 2000s. So I was there at some point during the Rafsanjani era,
Mhm.
and then into Khatami, and then, a bit of Ahmadinejad as well. Of course, for most of those years, I was a kid and I was just, we're just going to visit family and, just spending a lot of time with them. So I wasn't really aware of the different dynamics. And, obviously I knew things were different there, but politically I was not kind of aware of necessarily what was going on. But I, remember being very captivated by the country, and, it kind of sparked my desire to be a foreign correspondent. And, I felt like I had something unique to offer because I, felt like I kind of understood both Iran and the United States. Of course, I was a little bit naive. I only after many, many more years of study do I feel like I actually even have begun to understand Iran, but I at least kind of had that sort of longing, I guess, baked in. Um, but, I don't know that that's that unique from, other reporters. Like
Right.
you're embedded in a community, you're, part of the United States, you cover politics, and of course you're connected to the outcomes of what happens. And I think, local reporters are the same way for their communities.
Absolutely.
We all kind of have some point of view, some connection, maybe even some biases. And I think, at least in our work as maybe straight news reporters, it's our role to sort of recognize those and be aware of them and try to report as fully as possible from all different perspectives and not sort of try to just confirm our own previous thinking.
As a reporter living and working in the United States, I do have a vested interest in the United States being here for at least as long as my lights are on. I'm wondering, from your reporting and sources, what do the Iranian people and Iranian officials, what do they think of what the United States and what President Donald Trump is doing and saying he's doing? He recently gave a speech at the Board of Peace, his rival organization to the United Nations, where he's openly saying that he's giving the Iranian government 10 to maybe 15 days to decide whether or not to negotiate with him before some kind of action takes place. Do they take him literally? Do they take him seriously, or do they think this is all part of some kind of wild person's negotiation that to just force them to the table? How seriously do they take him? What's their read?
It's a little bit hard to say. I mean, the Iranian system can be quite opaque in its decision making and kind of its thinking. Um, I think one could argue that if they took him very seriously, they would be making a lot of immediate concessions in the nuclear negotiations that are happening right now. And we don't quite see evidence of that yet. I mean, they just had a second round. I think now they're drafting maybe some sort of like draft proposal. And we have to see sort of where the Iranians land on that. So I may be wrong. We're still kind of like waiting to see. But I don't see evidence that the Iranians really are fundamentally convinced this might happen. I think what they have tried to do is signal a lot of deterrence. And we've seen quite provocative statements from the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, kind of threatening U.S. warships. And there's, kind of some sort of signs that they're preparing for perhaps some kind of conflict. I should say also the Iranian government and kind of thought leaders or sort of people close to the military who, speak out in various platforms. They don't really see the 12-day war as necessarily ever having ended, which of course it kind of didn't. It was sort of an unofficial ceasefire. There was nothing signed. And so I sense there's been kind of a expectation that at some point that conflagration would kind of start up again. But of course, that was led mostly by Israel. And so, a US-led attack, I think, would be something quite different and on a different scale. So, I mean, in these kinds of things, there's always miscalculations, there's misreading of signals. Iran and the US don't have direct relations. Even these talks are often not happening directly. And so there's a lot of chance for miscalculation and maybe even underestimation of the other side. And so, I think bottom line, I think it's kind of hard to tell exactly, but my guess is they are maybe trying to prepare as much as they can, but seem to also still be taking the talk seriously, at least.
To hear that there's potential miscommunications of something of this magnitude is not very reassuring, but I appreciate the honesty. You mentioned that you have a book coming out. It's called Stolen Revolution: Betrayal and Hope in Modern Iran. Can you just walk through a little bit about where that story starts and what people can expect from it?
Sure. So it starts kind of in the years before the 1979 revolution. And we kind of have these six characters. It's me and my co-author, Bozorgmer Sharafuddin. And each of these characters kind of reflects a different part of Iranian society and a different era. So there's, a cleric who helped kind of form the Islamic Republic as it is today. And we kind of follow his journey as he then is kind of cast out the inner circle and then becomes a dissident and an opposition figure. There's a young woman who kind of comes of age during the Khatami reform era, and she becomes a very well-known poet and activist who really, through her poetry, kind of encapsulates what her generation went through. in the 90s and early 2000s. And then there's a businessman who returns to Iran to kind of spark a startup boom, and finds, basically the security state, the kind of Revolutionary Guard and the entities surrounding them are not prepared to allow any kind of independent business to really flourish on a large scale. There's a government official who's kind of an ideologue and a fan of the Islamic Republic's ideology and a follower of it, but he becomes quite disillusioned once he's in government and witnesses a lot of corruption. And then finally, there's two young women, kind of part of Iran's Gen Z, who come from fairly different circumstances, but also in some ways somewhat similar. Smaller towns and villages, conservative families, but manage to get themselves to Tehran. And, we kind of follow their story there, and they end up joining the Women Life Freedom protests in 2022. And it's the epilogue, it sort of ends with the Israeli attacks in June, and kind of what happened there and what that, what that portended for the future of the country. So, the idea was sort of to tell a history of Iran, which, there have been books that have told the history of Iran since the revolution, but we wanted to kind of take both a narrative tack through these really deep stories of these people, through whom we think that we've been able to tell kind of the larger story of Iran, and then also kind of an investigative approach. And so particularly in the section with the government official and the businessman, we felt like we were able to, we used documents, we interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of people to really show how the private sector in particular has not been allowed to flourish in Iran unless it kind of almost bends the knee to certain entities associated with the state and associated with, in particular, kind of the power structure. So that we felt was a unique contribution to the understanding of Iran.
It sounds like fascinating work that you've done, and congratulations on accomplishing that while so many things are happening. I wonder if you can weigh in on some of the parallels that some people might try to make between what's happening in Iran, popular protests, a government that had once had the support of, potentially a majority of people, and now clearly does not. A leader who might be, shall we say, breaking norms, to say the least. And there's some level of state-sponsored violence against people who are protesting. Some people might see a direct relationship or a direct parallel between what's happening in the United States under Trump, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and whatnot, and what's happening in Iran. And I'm wondering if that's the kind of, if that holds water from what you've been able to see and report out.
Mm-hmm. When we published the story that I mentioned earlier on the bazaar fire, the market fire, and the massacre there, that was right around the time that I believe Alex Preddy was killed in Minneapolis. And so a lot of the comments on that story were kind of making that comparison directly and saying, this is, ICE is getting their tips from the Revolutionary Guards or things like that. I do think scale matters and degree matters. And so I would not equate those two circumstances personally. And I think, there are obviously issues in the United States. I kind of, don't necessarily like, I'm not sure that they equate directly, because I think also you've seen protests in Minneapolis, and pushback, and that has led the government, the administration, to moderate on its policy and to change its policy. I believe they've reduced the ICE presence in Minneapolis and withdrawn from several places. So that we don't see that kind of reaction, or even kind of maybe even accountability to some extent in Iran. There's no kind of mechanism for people to be able to affect that kind of pressure on the government in the same way. Obviously, there's always kind of an interaction between society and the state in Iran, and Iranians have fought for a lot of rights in terms of not wearing the mandatory hijab anymore, or listening to the music they want to listen to or whatever it might be. Those are things that over years, decades, they have through like individual acts of resistance kind of overwhelmed the state's capacity to enforce the laws that it wants to enforce. And therefore, you've seen the state have to retreat from some of those. But in terms of kind of not carrying out state violence or pushing back against that, we've seen the state violence get worse over time. So I would just kind of caution Americans or people in general to, not everything is like everything else. And while I think we can look to Iran or other countries as examples or maybe cautionary tales or however we might want to look at it, and see kind of metaphors there. I think making those things equivalent is not necessarily, it doesn't allow for the clearest analysis, perhaps.
And to add to that point, the fact that we know the name Renee Good, who was killed right before Alex Preddy in the United States, the fact that we know those individual names, the two who have been killed during immigration enforcement action under the Trump administration, compared to the hundreds and thousands of countless people in Iran whose names aren't known. I think that speaks to the scale that you are sort of talking to.
Absolutely.
So you are currently in Turkey, hopefully with some new prospects coming up on the horizon. But I want to ask you right before we end, what has it been like just living someplace new and then getting this announcement that the reason that brought you there is changed, to say the least?
Again, I think I come back to it being quite bewildering. I made major life changes in order to come here, and I was happy to do those things because I'm dedicated to the job and I believe that this is an important story. And, even despite everything that's happened, I want to keep covering it. I still don't regret it. Like, even if I had to leave Istanbul tomorrow, I feel like it's been such a great thing for me to kind of just do something new and do something really difficult and know that I could do it. I had lived in DC for 10, almost 11 years, and that was great. And it was great for my career. I had a wonderful set of friends. I had a great apartment, like all those things. But you also kind of get comfortable in life and sort of maybe do the same routine every week.
Who needs comfort? It's overrated, right?
Yeah. And it's, I've always in my life kind of fought this battle between wanting adventure, but then also really craving routine. So, here, like, okay, I found my gym, I found my coffee shop, I, figured out where to buy groceries, et cetera. Like, those things I really crave. But then also, like, I get to do new things and take up new hobbies and meet new people. And so, like, even if like I have to pack up tomorrow and go home, I will have been grateful just to know that like I could do this. And I think it's made me more adventurous in other parts of my life. And so yeah, life happens and you can't really control every outcome. And this is my first layoff, and it was probably good for me to honestly experience this at some point.
That is an incredibly optimistic and positive view, which leads me to my last question. What's something that you've encountered or experienced that you think everyone should?
Okay, I have two answers to this. One is like more serious than the other. So I started rowing when I got to Istanbul. I had basically finished the book. We were pretty much done with the writing or definitely done with the writing and reporting, but like done also with the major edits. So I suddenly had all this extra time on my hands. And I was like, I want like 4 new hobbies. And one of them, I was like, I need to do something outdoors. And so I started rowing. So I took a couple lessons and then kind of joined this rowing club. And it's all in Turkish, and I barely understand what they're telling me to do, but I just kind of like look at what the people around me are doing and I copy them. And that's been great. I went this morning and it was really hard at times, but my hands are all like covered in blisters. But just to be able to get out on the water, Istanbul can be like a pretty crowded, kind of chaotic city, and you don't get a ton of nature if you don't really go looking for it. But to be out on the water is so peaceful. You see like wildlife, The city is just like gorgeous, like the skyline, you get to kind of experience all of that. So if you have a row club near you, highly recommend trying it. It's a low impact sport. You can do it for decades. People of all different shapes and sizes do it. So yeah, highly recommend. My other answer is sometimes it's just good to like escape a little bit. I very, very late in life watched the movie Heat. Have you seen this movie?
I have, and I can even probably quote some lines from it.
There's some lines we probably shouldn't quote on a family podcast, but it's Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, early 90s. It's just so good. It's like 3 hours long. You just like want it to keep going. It's just, if you haven't seen it, watch it. If you saw it a long time ago, rewatch it. Great movie.
And there's a sequel coming out.
I've heard, but obviously, I mean, no spoilers, like some things happen so that you can't really go back and change. So we'll see
Yeah.
how they handle that. But
It's remarkable that you mentioned that movie because it also is a movie that has an incredible amount of action sequences. It also has De Niro and Pacino, although not as much on screen time together as I would like.
yeah, but that one scene, there are a couple scenes, but the diner scene, so good.
It's great.
So you never wanted a regular type life?
The fuck is that? Barbecues and ball games?
Yeah.
But also there's the lesson, which is where the movie gets its name from.
Don't let yourself get attached to anything you are not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner.
Don't get attached to anything that you can't leave in 30 seconds if you feel the heat coming. So for a correspondent who's in the middle of everything, it seems like you might have taken that lesson. I don't know if you've taken that lesson to heart, but you're definitely in the middle of something hot. So I will wait for the version of your life on the big screen to come out.
Our jobs are honestly not that glamorous when it comes down to it.
For people who are watching this, they're going to see your curtains pulled, your lampshade. They're going to think, sign me up.
I always joke that if you were to make a realistic movie about journalism, it'd be like someone trying to get into their LexisNexis account and like forgetting the password 5 times. Like that's a more realistic snapshot of my day.
Oh, that is amazing. Yegeneh, I cannot thank you enough for the work that you do and for taking time out to talk today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure. And yeah, good luck with everything. I'll be a loyal reader.
I hope so. See you soon.
All right, bye.
You just gonna walk out on this woman? Not say goodbye?
That's the discipline.
That's pretty vacant.
Yeah, it is what it is. It's that or we both better go do something else, pal.
I don't know how to do anything else.
Neither do I.
I don't much want to either.
Neither do I.